He hadn't planned to come home that afternoon. In fact, the idea had struck him only minutes before his luxury sedan turned onto the long, familiar driveway. It was an impulse, born from sheer exhaustion, not sentiment. Ethan Vance, a self-made billionaire whose name echoed through boardrooms and financial headlines, had spent the last 3 months in a whirlwind of cities, meetings, and negotiations that had all blurred into one relentless marathon. His sprawling mansion, once the shining symbol of everything he had built, now felt like just another impersonal address on his itinerary. He told himself he was coming home for paperwork, for rest, for a moment of silence away from the constant noise of his empire. Yet, as the car rolled to a silent stop and he dismissed his driver, a strange, unfamiliar heaviness settled in his chest, the kind of feeling he had expertly learned to ignore. The house was quiet, too quiet for a family lunch hour. Ethan frowned slightly as he stepped inside, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the marble floor. He didn't announce his arrival, loosening the silk tie that felt like a noose around his neck. He moved past the grand art-filled hallway and followed the faint, delicate clink of cutlery. Toward the dining room, he anticipated the usual scene. His 3 daughters, Olivia, Sophie, and Mia, seated properly. His household staff, moving with trained efficiency. Everything controlled, precise, and orderly. Just the way he had designed his entire life to be. But what he saw instead made him freeze so suddenly that even his breath seemed to forget how to move. At the vast mahogany dining table sat his 3 daughters, looking angelic in their simple pale dresses. Their heads were bowed, hands folded neatly in their laps, and their eyes were closed. They weren't laughing, they weren't restless, they were deeply, profoundly still. And beside them, placing plates of food on the table, stood the new nanny, a quiet young woman named Clara. He had barely noticed during the hurried introductions weeks earlier. She wasn't serving with mechanical precision, but with a gentle tenderness that felt almost sacred. The girls were praying, not just reciting words they had been forced to memorize, but praying with a pure, heartfelt sincerity Ethan hadn't witnessed in years, maybe ever. For a moment, time collapsed. He was transported back to another dining table, one far smaller and far poorer, in a cramped apartment that smelled of his mother's cooking. He saw her pausing before every meal, her tired hands clasped, insisting on a moment of gratitude even when there was barely enough food to go around. He remembered rolling his eyes as a restless boy, promising himself that when he grew rich and powerful, he would never bow his head for anything or anyone. And yet, eerie, in the cold, opulent house that had cost him so much, his marriage, his peace of mind, his very presence in his children's lives, his daughters were doing exactly that. They were being led not by him, not by expensive tutors or family tradition, but by a woman whose name he had to consciously struggle to recall. Clara. Ethan remained frozen in the doorway, a ghost in his own home. He watched as the prayer ended and the girls opened their eyes. They didn't look up with the usual bored resignation he was used to. Instead, their faces were lit with calm, genuine smiles. "Thank you, Clara," they said in near unison, their voices soft, as if speaking to a cherished family member rather than a member of the staff. Something tightened in his throat, a knot of emotions he couldn't name. He started noticing details he had never cared to see before. How Clara knelt slightly when she spoke to Mia, his youngest, to be at her eye level. How she waited patiently until all 3 girls had their food before she stepped back to take her own seat, not at a separate table, but right there with them. He noticed how the room, usually so formal and imposing, felt warmer, more alive. 1,000 questions rushed through his mind, none of them about profit margins or stock prices. When had his daughters learned to pray with such feeling? Why did they look more peaceful right now than he had ever seen them in their entire lives? And the question that stung the most, why did it hurt so much to realize that he hadn't been the one to give them this peace? Clara finally looked up and noticed him standing there. Her eyes widened just a fraction in surprise before she respectfully lowered her gaze, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. But Ethan barely registered a reaction. His eyes were fixed on his daughters, on the way they began to eat, not with hurried obligation, but with quiet contentment. They were whole. In that profound stillness, a truth he had spent years outrunning finally cornered him. He had given them everything a fortune could buy: the mansion, the private schools, the financial security, but he had withheld the one thing that mattered: himself. The millions, the empire, the accolades. They all felt like cheap trinkles compared to this simple, beautiful moment of connection he had almost missed. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. 3 heads snapped up, and their expressions of surprise quickly melted into radiant smiles. "Papa!" Olivia exclaimed, her joy pure and unfiltered. And just like that, the invisible wall he had built between himself and his family shattered into a million pieces. He walked toward the table and sat down slowly, awkwardly, feeling like an intruder in a scene that had learned to exist without him. For the first time in decades, Ethan Vance felt small. Not small in power, but humbled by a profound sense of his own failure. He looked at Clara, his gaze now filled with a respect that bordered on awe. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. He asked about the prayer. He asked about their day. He asked Clara about herself. Truly listening for the first time in a very long time. He was learning what his absence had cost them, and what his presence could still heal. The lunch stretched on, longer than any board meeting he had ever chaired. When he finally stood to leave, not for a flight, but for his home office just down the hall, something inside him had irrevocably shifted. He was still a billionaire, still a titan of industry, but he was no longer blind to the real treasures in his life. As he walked away, he glanced back one more time at the table, imprinting the image into his memory. He silently promised himself and his daughters that unannounced arrivals would become a habit, not a rare exception. He had a new kind of wealth to build now, one that couldn't be measured in dollars, but in moments just like this. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the most powerful moments in life are often the quiet ones we almost miss, then please subscribe to our channel. Stories like this aren't just meant to be watched. They're meant to be felt, remembered, and shared. Thank you for listening.